Hi, welcome back to Baking with Ben. I'm Ben, and today we're going to be baking some rye sourdough. Hotly anticipated, and people requested it, so it's here. Baking with Ben. Okay, first thing we need to do is we need to mix our rye starter. In rye sourdough, a large proportion of it is sourdough starter. So it's really important that the sourdough starter is the key thing, and it's where we put most of our attention, and we make sure that it's nice and active and really ripe and in a really good condition. Okay, so good condition, you can see bubbles in there, that's great, and it's just about doubled in height. It's feeling nice and warm. Also, it's smelling really, really good and active. It smells sort of like milk that's just about to go off. Okay. I built this sourdough starter up from a little pot like this, tiny little pot of sourdough starter, and just over a couple of days built it up to about 600 grams. Okay, so I'll pop a link in the description for the formula. Okay, the other large proportion of our rye sourdough is a soaker. I'm not sure if you can see this. So our soaker is roughly half and half seeds and hot water. Now, ideally, you want to take your seeds, fill it up with water, roughly half seeds, half water, and then leave them for 12 hours. And with soakers, the idea is that we are trying to equalise the amount of moisture that's inside of these things. I've got a mixture of seeds here, but you could just use one seed. Usually we use a cracked rye, and then we'll soak that overnight. I didn't soak mine overnight, so instead what you can do is you can pour some boiling water on it and then leave it for about 2 hours, and that should suffice. So in here we've got 200 grams of rye flour and 14 grams of salt. We're going to just check with this water, which I've got sort of lukewarm, bit warmer than lukewarm. Ideally you want to keep your sourdough starter, your rye sourdough starter, really warm. Thankfully it's been quite hot in outside at the moment, so this has been really active, and it doesn't need much activity, but this is our last opportunity. The warmth of the water is our last opportunity to sort of impart activity into our sourdough starter. So if you've ever struggled with your sourdough not being active enough, this is a really good way of building that activity by making sure that it's warmer. The warmer the water is, the more active the sourdough will be. But be careful, too warm and you risk killing the starter. So just take my scraper here. I'm just going to check to see if this starter is ready to use. I'm just going to take a lump of it out. I'm going to do the float test, which is if you've seen my videos before, you'll know it's something that I do. Just sort of let the dough float on the top like that. And if it floats, it's good. If it sinks, leave it a little bit longer in the sunshine. Okay, cool. So I'm going to weigh the water into the flour, and then we'll weigh the rye starter in and the soaker as well. So all we need is 130 grams of water. It's not very much. We'll weigh the starter in as well. 620 grams. Make sure you always zero your scales off. Take your scraper and just take a big lump of that out. Going a little bit over the odds on this, but that might be alright. If your soaker has got a little bit of extra moisture inside, just make sure you just drain off some of the moisture. You don't want that moisture to get into the loaf. You just over-saturate it, and then it'd be absolutely terrible to handle. So just give it a little bit of a moisture drain out. Great. that'll do. 400 grams of the soaker, which should be around about all of it. So we'll pour that in as well. Oh yeah, perfect. Okay, and then with this, super simple, I'm just going to mix it all together with my hands. One of the best things about rye is that it has no gluten, so we don't need to worry about building any gluten structure into this dough. It's literally a case of just mixing it all together, letting it prove up, and then sort of manhandling it into a shape that we want it to go into. So we create this sort of slurry, basically. I don't know how to say that in a way that's not that's a little bit more attractive, but we basically create this sort of slurry, yeah, porridge, maybe is a slightly more appealing phrase. But we mix all of this until it's completely dry, using exactly the same technique as I use with my normal white sourdough, which is just a sort of scrunch technique. Make sure that dough's getting right between your hands. And you'll feel that this dough is completely different to any white bread you've used before. This is so much stickier and it will just stay on your hands the whole time. Try and get underneath it, flip it over, and you really want to make sure that there isn't any dry bits underneath the bowl, which this doesn't have any dry bits, which is great. And so once that's thoroughly incorporated, just use your scraper, just scrape the excess off your hands, like that. Don't be tempted to add any more flour to this. It is kind of like a paste-like structure, and because rye flour it can't create gluten, so you're never going to get that same level of absorption that you would get from something that has a gluten structure like your white bread. So it is literally as simple as that. Rye sourdough is super, super easy. We're about halfway through the process now. Once we've mixed our sourdough starter with our remaining fresh flour and our soaker and our water and the salt and stuff, literally all we're going to do is just let this sit around in some warm place for a while, grow a little bit more, and then we're going to just slough this into a tin, leave it again and bake it, and that is how easy it is. You can start to see that it's fermenting. Pretty much every stage of a rye sourdough, you know that it's fermenting when you can start to see it doming on the top. Obviously you're looking for the bubbles underneath as well, and that bulk fermentation is just to get the dough working through the extra bit of flour that we've put through it. So following our 30-minute bulk fermentation, what we're going to do is we're going to scoop this out into a pre-oiled baking tin. Now the reason that we're using a baking tin, like I said before, is because we don't have any gluten in here, and we need all the structure for creating a loaf from the tin. So it can use these like nice hard metal sides to hold itself up. Okay. If you don't have a baking tin, you can freeform this loaf, but it is going to be quite flat and sort of pancakey and really chilled out. So I'll show you how we do this. So it's really, really handy to have some water on hand here. And what we're going to do is we're going to get the scales. So you grab your scales, we get a little bit of water on our hands, bit of water on the scales, put the scales on, and we're also going to get our scraper nice and wet as well. And our hands nice and wet. And this is like 100% the easiest shaping you will ever do with some bread. There's like zero technique to it. We're basically forming it into a rectangle. We're forming it into the shape that can fit into there. Plenty of water on our hands, scales on 0. I'm going to go into the bowl here, and we don't want to degas it too much, so just try and take as much out as you can in like one fell swoop. So I'm going to aim for, let's say, I'm going to take half of this out. I think about 900 would be good. That's about. So I'm going to pick that loaf up from the scales, get one of our hands wet, and then what we're going to do is just going to sort of form it into a rectangle like this. Okay. We get our tin, and if it starts to stick too much, just go back into the water and just form those edges off like that. Just create a nice, easy rectangle, and we're just going to plop that in there. Okay. Nice. And if there are any excess bits, like if you just dropped a little bit, I've got few bits that have dropped off here. You can just pop those in as well. You don't have to be fancy about it. Okay, so you'll end up with something like this. Okay, and then when you're there, I like to just sort of finish off the top just by dunking my scraper in the water and just place my scraper inside like that, and then just press it down, and that's just going to encourage it into the corners and also just flatten off your top as well. So once you've washed your hands off, we've got a little bit of rye flour, and then this is the main way that we check to see if the dough is proved. Okay, so I'm going to sprinkle the surface of the dough with a fairly generous sprinkling of the rye flour, just raw rye flour, and then as it proves up, it's going to crack on the surface of the dough, and that's going to show us that we've got a nice prove to the loaf. And we're looking for around about 2 to 3 millimeters of cracking. I'll show you later on, you'll know what I mean. So get yourself a handful of rye flour and just generously sprinkle it evenly across the surface. You want it to be even. So that's our loaf. We're going to just stick, you're going to stick some cling film in over the top of this. I'm going to stick stick a lid on top. I'm going to leave that to prove for around about 2 hours, and then we'll have a look at it then. Okay? Cool. Oh, wrong way around. We're going to check on the proof of these rye sourdoughs now. We just want to check to see that they're about the right place that we want them to be before they go into bake. It's important that we keep checking these just to make sure, because rye flour is a lot more active than white flour, and the reason for that is that the rye berry has a lot more yeast on the outside of it than, say, a wheat berry does. So it's going to be super loads more active. Okay, let's check it out. Okay, so as you can see, this one is looking pretty well proved, and you can see the rye flour that we've put on the top started to open up. As it started to dome on the top, we're getting these cracks along the surface, and those cracks, you want them to open up to about 2 to 3 mil. That shows that it's roughly about proved. We're getting almost half a centimetre on some of these cracks, which is kind of pretty good. Check this one out as well. Yeah, so the same there. We're getting some nice cracking on the surface. And at about this point, we can turn the oven on. That wants to go on to 200 degrees. That's 200 degrees Celsius. Let that come up to temperature, and then we'll throw these in the oven. Right then, so the oven's up to temperature, 200 degrees Celsius, and then we'll just throw these bad boys in, and they're going to get an hour. It's worth checking it after like 40 minutes, just to see how it's getting on. Are you okay, hun? And that's it. That is the simple rye sourdough. We'll see how it looks in a little while. Okay, so let's just check these after 40 minutes. See what they're like. Oh, nice. That one I'd say is almost about done. But this one a little bit bigger. Yeah, that's going to take a little bit longer. I'm going to leave that in for a bit longer there. Just drop the temperature down, and we'll go for another 10 minutes on that one. Okay, so after 50 minutes in the oven, 200 degrees Celsius, we've got our loaves here, and they're looking pretty good. I probably overproved these a little bit too much, but fine. We're gonna we've taken them out of the tins. It's really important that you don't cut into these straight away. It'll take around about 24 hours for them to be at their peak, because what's happening is the starches inside of the loaf, that it's going to take a really long time for them to gelatinize properly. So you need to leave them. If you cut into them straight away, they're just going to sort of turn into like a really squidgy, mushy, congealed sort of situation. So I'm pretty happy with that. It's looking pretty good. Smells great. Bing, bang, boom. Done. I'm going to do another video at some point soon. It might be cinnamon buns or something like that. Again, thanks for watching, and thanks for commenting. And if you do have any questions, again, feel free to drop me a message, and I'll try and answer. Cool.